The hushed courtroom fell silent as Staff Sergeant Jackson Reeves sat motionless in his wheelchair, his specially trained Belgian Malinois sentinel alert at his side. The decorated Marine's eyes remained fixed forward, his expression unreadable. No one, not the stern-faced judge, the confident prosecutor, nor the anxious jury, suspected that in mere moments a simple hand gesture would unleash a sequence of events that would expose a devastating truth and forever change the lives of everyone present. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Jefferson County Courthouse had never seen such a peculiar case. The gallery was filled to capacity, the air thick with tension as the proceedings of State v. Reeves continued into their third day. Staff Sergeant Jackson Reeves, 34, sat in his customized wheelchair, facing charges of criminal trespassing, assault, and using a trained animal as a weapon. His military commendations, including a Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts, seemed at odds with the accusations that had brought him here. Beside him, Sentinel maintained perfect discipline, his amber eyes continuously scanning the room with the same vigilance he had shown during their deployments in Kandahar. The dog's muscular frame remained still except for the occasional ear twitch when the prosecutor's voice rose in emphasis. District Attorney Elaine Mercer approached the jury box with measured steps, her charcoal suit and crimson blouse chosen specifically for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice resonating through the oak-paneled room, "I understand the instinct to view Sergeant Reeves through the lens of his military service. His sacrifice for our country is undeniable." She paused, letting her words settle before pivoting sharply. "But this case isn't about battlefield heroism. It's about what happens when trauma leads to dangerous vigilantism." She gestured toward Sentinel with a manicured hand. "This animal was trained for combat operations, not for suburban neighborhoods, not for confronting civilians." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And certainly not for attacking an innocent father on his own property." Low murmurs rippled through the gallery. Some spectators nodded in agreement. Others exchanged skeptical glances. The local media had painted conflicting portraits of Reeves, either a troubled veteran whose PTSD had manifested in paranoid behavior, or a perceptive hero who had acted when authorities wouldn't. Jackson Reeves remained impassive. Since the IED explosion that had severed his spinal cord and damaged his vocal cords 3 years earlier, he had learned to economize every word, every expression. Speech required effort, so silence had become his natural state. His court-appointed attorney, Martin Geller, seemed perpetually uncomfortable, shuffling papers and adjusting his tie too frequently. The disparity in preparedness between the prosecution and defense was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. On the witness stand sat Raymond Decker, the alleged victim. His confident posture and articulate responses had made a strong impression on the jury throughout his testimony. "I was simply standing at my back door having a cigarette," Decker explained, his voice carrying just the right note of indignation. "Next thing I know, this man is in my yard accusing me of things, and then that dog comes charging at me unprovoked." Judge Gabriella Sandoval watched with practiced neutrality, though those familiar with her expressions might have detected a hint of skepticism in her dark eyes. At 58, she had presided over hundreds of cases, developing an intuition for witness credibility that rarely failed her. Something in Decker's too-perfect narrative had triggered that intuition. Decker continued his testimony, describing how Sentinel had lunged at him, causing him to fall and suffer injuries that required medical attention. "I had to get 8 stitches, he said, gesturing to a scar on his forearm, "all because this man," he pointed toward Jackson, "decided to take the law into his own hands." It was at this precise moment that Sentinel's demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward, his body tensing almost imperceptibly. Only Jackson noticed the shift, his years of working with the dog having attuned him to the animal's every signal. With deliberate control, Jackson raised his right hand from the armrest of his wheelchair. His fingers formed a specific configuration. Thumb. He tucked against palm, index, and ring fingers extended, middle and pinky fingers curled inward. The movement was subtle, nothing that would draw attention from observers focused on Decker's dramatic testimony. Judge Sandoval noticed first, her gaze shifting from Decker to the defendant's hand, then to the dog. "Mr. Reeves," she began, "I must ask that you—" Before she could finish, Sentinel rose in one fluid motion. There were no growls, no aggressive movements, just purposeful action. The dog walked forward with military precision, moving past the defense table toward the witness stand. The bailiff stepped forward uncertainly, hand moving to his holster. "Your Honor?" Judge Sandoval raised her hand slightly, indicating he should wait. Something in the controlled manner of the dog's approach and Reeves's calm demeanor suggested this wasn't a threat but something else entirely. Sentinel stopped directly in front of Decker, who had pressed himself back in his chair, face suddenly pale. "Get that animal away from me," he demanded, his composed demeanor cracking for the first time. The dog didn't growl or bark. Instead, he focused intently on the man's suit jacket, then with surgical precision nudged his muzzle against the inside pocket. Before Decker could react, Sentinel had extracted something small and placed it carefully on the courtroom floor. A collective gasp rose from the gallery as people leaned forward to see. Lying on the polished hardwood was a small purple hair clip decorated with a butterfly motif. Its plastic surface was smeared with what appeared to be dried blood. The courtroom froze in perfect stillness. Judge Sandoval rose slowly from her seat, eyes fixed on the object. "Mr. Decker," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "would you care to explain why you have a child's blood-stained hair accessory concealed in your pocket?" Decker's face had gone from pale to ashen. I don't know how that got in there. I've never seen that before." The prosecutor stood motionless, her case visibly unraveling before her eyes. Defense attorney Geller looked as shocked as everyone else, clearly having had no foreknowledge of this development. From the back of the courtroom, a small voice broke through the tension. "That's mine." All heads turned to see a small boy, perhaps 7 years old, standing beside a social worker in the last row. His face bore fading bruises, and his eyes were fixed not on the hair clip, but on Sentinel. Judge Sandoval maintained her composure with remarkable discipline, though her voice had taken on a new edge. "Bailiff, please secure that item as evidence. Mr. Decker, you will remain in this courtroom." She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will take an immediate recess. Court officers, please ensure Mr. Decker does not leave the building." As the courtroom erupted in shocked conversations, Jackson Reeves remained still, one hand resting gently on Sentinel's head as the dog returned to his side. The job was done. The truth, which no one had been willing to hear through conventional channels, had finally found its voice, not through Jackson's damaged vocal cords, but through the unlikely partnership of a wounded warrior and his extraordinary companion. The path that had led them to this moment had begun years earlier, in the dust and danger of Afghanistan, where both man and dog had learned that sometimes survival depends not on strength or speed, but on trusting what others cannot see. Rhythmic cadence of helicopter rotors sliced through the Afghan night, their thunderous beat drowning out the sporadic gunfire in the distance. Operation Cobalt Shield was in its 14th hour, and the elite Marine Special Operations Team had successfully neutralized a high-value target in the mountainous region of Helmand Province. Staff Sergeant Jackson Reeves crouched in the narrow confines of a mud-brick compound, his night vision equipment revealing the landscape in ghostly green hues as he conducted a final sweep. Echo actual to hammer lead. Perimeter secure. Prepare for extraction in 3 mics, crackled the voice in his tactical headset. Copy, Echo actual. Hammer lead, completing final sweep, Jackson responded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. At his side moved his military working dog, then called Spectre 1 year before he would become Sentinel in civilian life. The Belgian Malinois, with his sleek tan coat and black muzzle, moved with predatory precision through the darkened rooms. Trained in both explosive detection and personnel apprehension, Spectre represented the pinnacle of military canine capability, having completed over 40 successful combat missions in his 3 years of deployment. The relationship between handler and military working dog transcended typical human-animal bonds. In the chaos of combat operations, they functioned as a single organism, each interpreting and responding to subtle cues imperceptible to others, each trusting the other with their lives. Jackson and Spectre had developed an almost telepathic connection over 18 months of working together. Their communication refined to the point where hand signals, posture shifts, and eye contact could convey complex instructions without words. As they approached the final room, Spectre's behavior changed. His ears pricked forward, his muscular body tensing slightly, a signal Jackson had learned to interpret with absolute seriousness. He raised his closed fist, signaling the 2 Marines. Behind him, to halt. Something had triggered Spectre's alertness. Possible contact, West Corner, final room, Jackson whispered into his comms, his M4 carbine raised as he assessed the situation. Spectre moved forward cautiously, his nose working. The air currents? Then instead of the aggressive posture that would indicate a human threat, the dog sat down abruptly, the passive alert signal for explosives. IED! Everyone back now, Jackson ordered, already calculating the safest withdrawal route. Military. Protocol dictated they should retreat and call in explosive ordnance disposal specialists, but instinct told Jackson that something wasn't right. Spectre's behavior suggested complexity beyond a standard explosive device. Spectre, detail, he commanded softly. This was a specialized directive they had developed together, requesting more specific information about the nature of the threat. The dog moved cautiously forward, sniffing in a deliberate pattern around the room's perimeter, then stopped at a particular section of the dirt floor. He pawed once, then backed away, looking at Jackson with unmistakable urgency. Jackson approached carefully, using his tactical light to examine the area Spectre had indicated. The dirt appeared freshly disturbed. Using his knife, he scraped away a thin layer of soil, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal case. "Sir, we need to move now," urged Corporal Mendez behind him. "Extraction window closing." 1 minute, Jackson replied, continuing to carefully expose the object. It wasn't attached to any visible triggering mechanism, which suggested it might not be an IED after all. With extreme caution, he lifted the metal case, finding it surprisingly light. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The decision to open it violated every protocol. But something about Spectre's behavior, the absence of his full explosive alert posture, suggested this discovery warranted immediate inspection. Inside the case lay a stack of documents and a USB drive carefully sealed in waterproof packaging. "Intelligence package," Jackson announced, quickly securing the items in his tactical vest, moving to extraction now. They never made it to the landing zone. As the team navigated through a narrow gully 500 meters from the compound, the night erupted into chaos. The distinctive whoosh of an RPG split the air seconds before the explosion illuminated the landscape in harsh, orange light. The rocket had missed its mark, impacting the ridge above them, but the secondary effect was devastating. The blast triggered a hidden IED daisy chain buried along the path ahead. Jackson's last conscious memory was of Spectre lunging toward him as the ground beneath them erupted in fire and shrapnel. The dog's body slammed into his chest, knocking him backward just as the world dissolved into searing pain and darkness. He awoke 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany, his body immobilized, his throat raw from intubation. Through the fog of morphine and trauma, his first coherent question was about Spectre. The nurse's hesitation told him everything before she spoke. The dog was critically injured, Sergeant. They had to evacuate him separately. That's all I know. Over the following weeks, Jackson learned the full extent of his injuries. The IED blast had severed his spinal cord at the T10 vertebra, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Shrapnel had damaged his vocal cords, reducing his once commanding voice to a hoarse whisper. 3 other Marines had sustained serious injuries, but miraculously, all had survived. The intelligence package they had recovered proved invaluable, leading to the disruption of a major insurgent network and the prevention of planned attacks on coalition forces. Jackson received commendations for his actions, but they meant little in the face of his new reality and the uncertainty surrounding Spectre's fate. During his extended rehabilitation at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, Jackson threw himself into the grueling process of adapting to life with paraplegia. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychological counseling, he approached each with the same disciplined determination that had characterized his military career. His speech gradually improved from a whisper to a functional but permanently altered voice, requiring careful pacing and deliberate enunciation to be understood. 6 months into his rehabilitation, Jackson received an unexpected visitor. Marine Corps Captain Layla Harlow, the commanding officer of the Military Working Dog Program, arrived at his room one afternoon. "Sergeant Reeves," she began, standing, at parade rest beside his wheelchair, "I'm here about Spectre." Jackson's heart rate accelerated. After months of unanswered inquiries, he had begun to assume the worst. "He survived," Harlow continued, noting the relief that washed over Jackson's face. "But like you, he didn't come home the same. Shrapnel damage to his right eye and ear, multiple fractures, now healed but with some permanent mobility limitations." She handed Jackson a tablet displaying photos of the dog in a rehabilitation facility. Spectre's right eye was clouded with scarring, and a significant patch of fur on his right flank had regrown in a different color pattern where burn injuries had healed. "He's been deemed unsuitable for continued military service," Harlow explained. "Standard procedure would be to place him for adoption through our civilian rehabilitation partners." Jackson stared at the images, his throat tightening with emotion he rarely permitted himself to display. "Ma'am, with respect—" "I'm ahead of you, Sergeant," Harlow interrupted with a hint of a smile. "Spectre's service record is exemplary. His connection with you specifically has been noted by multiple commanding officers. I've initiated paperwork for a specialized rehabilitation program that would pair him with you as a service dog following your medical retirement." Jackson looked up, momentarily unable to speak for reasons unrelated to his physical injuries. "The process isn't simple," Harlow continued. "He'll need retraining to transition from tactical operations to civilian service work. You'll need specialized handler training adapted to your new physical realities. The program takes 6 to 9 months, and there's no guarantee of success." "When do we start?" Jackson asked, his altered voice carrying an intensity that required no amplification. 3 weeks later, Jackson faced Spectre across a training room at the K9 Veteran Rehabilitation Center in Maryland. The dog, now officially renamed Sentinel, to mark his transition to civilian service, showed no initial signs of recognizing his former handler. The months of separation, combined with both of their injuries, had created a distance that made Jackson's chest ache more than any of his physical wounds. "He's undergone significant trauma," explained Dr. Marina Chen, the center's behavioral specialist. Military working dogs develop complex responses to injury and separation. He may need time to reconnect. Jackson nodded, understanding too well how trauma reshapes neural pathways and emotional responses. He had wheeled himself to the center of the room, respecting the space Dr. Chen had advised maintaining for this first reintroduction. "Sentinel, come," he called, using the new name deliberately, acknowledging that they were both different now. The dog regarded him with his one good eye, head slightly tilted in a posture suggesting recognition, battling with uncertainty. Jackson made a decision then. Rather than continuing with the standard reintroduction protocol, he raised his right hand and formed the unique hand signal they had developed in Afghanistan. A signal that had only ever meant one thing between them: "I trust you with my life." Sentinel's posture changed instantly. His ears pricked forward, his body tensing in alert recognition. For 3 heartbeats, he remained perfectly still. Then, with a soft whine unlike any sound he had made in military service, he moved forward and placed his head gently on Jackson's knee. Dr. Chen observed with carefully contained amazement. "In 20 years of rehabilitation work, I've never seen reconnection happen that quickly," she noted, making notations on her tablet. "Whatever you two went through together created something extraordinary." Jackson rested his hand on Sentinel's head, feeling the familiar texture of his fur, noticing the new scars that matched his own. "We're not the same," he said quietly, "but we're still us." The rehabilitation path ahead would be demanding for both of them. Sentinel would need to unlearn tactical responses developed for combat zones while developing new skills specifically tailored to Jackson's needs. Jackson would need to adapt his handling techniques to work from a wheelchair with limited vocal capacity. But in that moment of reconnection, something fundamental had been established. They would navigate this new reality as they had navigated war together, communicating in ways others couldn't see or understand. Neither man nor dog could have imagined how crucial that unique bond would prove 3 years later, when they would find themselves in a civilian battlefield of a different kind, where truth needed a voice and justice required witnesses who could speak without words. The suburban neighborhood of Pinecrest Heights embodied the American dream, with its manicured lawns, 2-car garages, and community playground, where children's laughter provided a constant soundtrack during summer evenings. Jackson Reeves had purchased his single-story ranch house specifically for its accessibility potential, and over 18 months had methodically modified it to accommodate his wheelchair and specific needs. The adaptations were subtle but comprehensive: widened doorways, lowered countertops in the kitchen, a roll-in shower with strategically placed grab bars, and ramps disguised as architectural features leading to both front and back entrances. Most neighbors knew him only as the quiet veteran who kept to himself, his interactions limited to brief nods or the occasional hoarse good morning while retrieving his mail. Few ever approached him directly. His military-straight posture, even in his wheelchair, and Sentinel's vigilant presence created an unintentional barrier. Those who made assumptions about his isolation often attributed it to PTSD or depression, common enough among veterans returning from combat zones. The reality was both simpler and more complex. Jackson had never been particularly social before his injury, and the effort required for verbal communication now made casual conversation exponentially more taxing. His daily routine maintained. The disciplined structure of his military years: physical therapy exercises at precisely 5:30 a.m., breakfast at 6:45, and then several hours devoted to his remote work as a security systems consultant. The position leveraged his tactical expertise without requiring extensive vocal interaction, allowing him to communicate primarily through detailed written reports and occasional video conferences, where his insights were valued enough that colleagues accommodated his communication limitations. Afternoons typically included training sessions with Sentinel, neighborhood reconnaissance walks that maintained the dog's environmental awareness skills, and volunteer work with the local veterans. Affairs office, where Jackson helped fellow veterans navigate the labyrinthine process of securing benefits and services. His assistance typically came in the form of meticulously organized documentation rather than verbal advocacy. This carefully constructed routine provided structure and purpose, though Jackson would never have described himself as happy. Content, perhaps. Functional, certainly. But the vibrancy and camaraderie that had characterized his life in the Marines remained a phantom limb, something his mind still reached for, even knowing it was gone. The routine shattered on an unremarkable Tuesday in April, when Jackson and Sentinel returned from their afternoon walk to find a small figure huddled against their front door. The boy couldn't have been older than 7, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that appeared slept in. What immediately caught Jackson's attention were the bruises, a fading yellowish mark around his left eye, and fresher contusions on his forearms, partially concealed by a too large sweater despite the warm spring weather. Sentinel's demeanor changed instantly, his usual alert watchfulness transforming into something gentler. Without command, the dog moved forward and positioned himself beside the child, maintaining a respectful distance while clearly communicating protective presence. The boy startled at their approach but didn't run. His eyes widened at the sight of Jackson's wheelchair, then shifted to Sentinel with unmistakable longing. "Is he a police dog?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible. Jackson wheeled closer, stopping at a non-threatening distance. "Military?" he replied, economizing words as always. "His name is Sentinel." "Like a guard?" Jackson nodded. "Exactly like that." The boy studied Sentinel with the serious concentration unique to children. "Does he protect you?" "We protect each other," Jackson answered, the roughness of his damaged voice softening slightly. He assessed the child with the same observational acuity that had kept his team alive in Afghanistan, noting the defensive posture, the slight wince when the boy shifted position, the way his eyes constantly darted toward the house next door. "What's your name?" Jackson asked. "Ethan?" the boy replied after a hesitation that spoke volumes. "I'm Jackson. Are you hungry, Ethan?" The simple question caused a complex reaction. Eager nodding followed immediately by worried glances toward the neighboring house. "I can't stay long. He'll be home at 5. The pronoun without an antecedent told Jackson everything he needed to know. He had encountered enough abuse survivors during his volunteer work to recognize the signs, the hypervigilance, the time awareness, the careful calculation of risk that no child should need to master. "Understood," Jackson replied, using his key fob to unlock the front door. "Quick sandwich, then." Inside, Jackson maintained deliberate casualness, preparing a peanut butter sandwich while asking minimal questions. Ethan gradually relaxed enough to interact with Sentinel, who demonstrated unusual gentleness, lying beside the boy's chair with his head resting lightly against Ethan's leg. "He knows," Ethan said suddenly, looking at Jackson with unexpected perceptiveness. "Like he can tell." Jackson nodded. "He's trained to recognize stress. Because of the war." "Yes." Jackson placed the sandwich and a glass of milk before the boy. In Afghanistan, he could tell when somebody was afraid, even when they tried to hide it. Ethan took a bite of sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "My dad says being scared is for babies." "Your dad is wrong," Jackson replied simply. "Every Marine I served with felt fear. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid." Ethan absorbed this with surprising solemnity. "I tried to tell my teacher, but Dad said nobody would believe me because I make up stories." He pulled up his sleeve, revealing a distinct, handprint bruise around his upper arm. "This isn't made up." Jackson felt a familiar cold focus settling over him, the tactical clarity that had always preceded combat operations. "I believe you, Ethan." The boy's eyes welled with tears. "Mom left last year. It got worse after that. He says if I tell anyone, they'll put me in a place where nobody wants me." "That's not true," Jackson said, his damaged voice carrying absolute conviction. "There are procedures, trained professionals. I can help you report this properly." Ethan shook his head frantically. "He's a security guard at the courthouse. He says all the judges know him. He says the police never believe kids over grown-ups." The boy's breathing had accelerated, panic building visibly. Recognizing the signs of an impending anxiety attack, Jackson made a subtle hand gesture. Sentinel immediately moved closer to Ethan, applying gentle pressure against his side, a grounding technique the dog had been trained to provide for Jackson during his own episodes of traumatic recall. "Breathe with him," Jackson instructed, "quietly. Feel his ribs move, match your breathing to his." The simple physical focus gradually calmed Ethan. When he could speak again, his words carried the weight of accumulated terror. "He said if I ever told anyone he'd hurt me so bad, I'd wish I was dead." Jackson had heard similar threats recounted by civilians in war zones, the universal language of abusers, transcending cultural and geographical boundaries. He knew the statistical realities of child abuse cases, particularly those involving parents with connections to law enforcement or the legal system. The path through official channels was fraught with potential failure points, where Ethan could be returned to his abuser if the system failed to function as designed. Standard procedure would be to contact Child Protective Services immediately. That was the legal obligation, the correct protocol, the responsible action. Jackson had always respected chain of command, had built his entire adult life around systems and structures designed to handle complex situations. But systems failed. He had seen it in Afghanistan, when intelligence was disregarded, when strategic decisions were made by those too far removed from ground realities. He had experienced it personally during his medical retirement, when errors had delayed critical treatments, and he had witnessed it repeatedly during his volunteer work with veterans who fell through administrative cracks in systems designed to serve them. The sound of a car door slamming next door shattered the moment of contemplation. Ethan jumped to his feet, panic returning instantly. "He's home early," the boy whispered, already moving toward the door. "I have to go. If he finds out I was here—" "Wait," Jackson said, wheeling quickly to a drawer near his desk. He removed what appeared to be a standard medical alert bracelet and handed it to Ethan. "Put this on. Keep it hidden under your sleeve." Ethan examined the simple silicone band with its medical caduceus symbol. "What is it?" "GPS tracker," Jackson explained tersely. "Designed for veterans with traumatic brain injuries who might wander. Press the symbol 3 times in rapid succession if you're in immediate danger. It alerts my phone." The ethical boundaries of the situation weren't lost on Jackson. Giving a tracking device to a child without parental consent violated numerous protocols. But the alternative, sending Ethan back into that house without protection, violated something far more fundamental. "I'll make some calls," Jackson promised as Ethan moved toward the door. "There are people who can help, proper channels. But this is backup, understand?" Ethan nodded, slipping the bracelet under his sleeve. "Like in the military, reinforcements." "Exactly like that," Jackson confirmed. "Sentinel and I will be your reinforcements." After Ethan left, Jackson sat motionless for several minutes, processing the encounter with the same methodical thoroughness he had once applied to mission parameters. Then he reached for his phone and began making calls, first to his contact at Child Protective Services, then to a veterans advocacy lawyer who owed him several favors, and finally to a detective in the Special Victims Unit whom he had met during his volunteer work. Each conversation followed the same pattern: Detailed reporting of observed evidence, careful distinction between direct observation and inference, and request for immediate investigation. Each ended with the same bureaucratic responses. Procedures would be followed, reports would be filed, assessments would be scheduled. None offered the immediate intervention the situation demanded. That night, Jackson positioned himself near the window overlooking the neighboring property, sentinel alert beside him. They maintained watch in silent vigilance, prepared to respond if the emergency alert activated. The scene evoked too many parallels to nighttime observation posts in hostile territory. The same tension, the same heightened awareness, the same grave understanding of what failure might cost. Morning came without incident, bringing with it the familiar struggle between protocol and protection that had characterized Jackson's military career. He had always believed in systems, in proper channels and established procedures, but he had also learned through bitter experience that sometimes protocols failed precisely those they were designed to protect. The question that kept circling in his mind as he watched Ethan board the school bus, the concealed bracelet visible as a slight bulge beneath his sleeve, was one that had haunted him since Afghanistan. When systems fail, where does duty lie? 3 days later, at precisely 11:42 p.m., the emergency alert on Jackson's phone activated with 3 rapid pulses. By the time he and Sentinel reached the neighboring house, the choice between protocol and protection had already been made. What happened next would eventually lead them to that courtroom, to that moment when a simple hand signal would set in motion events that would finally give voice to a truth the system had failed to hear. The emergency alert's pulsing glow illuminated Jackson's bedroom at 11:42 p.m., accompanied by the distinct vibration pattern he had programmed specifically for Ethan's tracker. He was awake and moving before consciousness fully registered. Muscle memory from countless midnight operations guiding his transfer from bed to wheelchair with practiced efficiency. Sentinel was already alert, standing at attention beside the chair as Jackson secured his service vest with a single practiced motion. "Response mode," Jackson instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. The command activated Sentinel's advanced service training, heightened environmental awareness, protective positioning, and readiness to receive complex tactical signals rather than standard service dog commands. Jackson retrieved his phone, confirming the alert's authenticity while accessing the GPS location data. The tracking system indicated Ethan was still at his residence, with the signal showing micro-movements, consistent with a person in distress rather than normal sleep patterns. The technology, originally developed for monitoring veterans with traumatic brain injuries, provided surprisingly sophisticated analytics that Jackson had never expected to deploy in a civilian context. He briefly considered calling 911, weighing the potential consequences of emergency services arriving without context. Standard responses to domestic disturbance calls often escalated situations, particularly when the alleged perpetrator had connections to law enforcement. The responding officers would approach with deference to a fellow security professional, potentially dismissing a child's claims against an adult's denials. Decision made. Jackson navigated his customized van from his garage and positioned it one street over from Ethan's house, using the neighborhood's interlocking cul-de-sacs to approach from an unexpected direction. The tactical considerations felt surreal in this suburban setting, considerations of approach angles, visibility limitations, and potential exit routes flowing through his mind with the same automatic precision they had in combat zones. Leaving Sentinel with a hand signal to remain vigilant, Jackson wheeled himself to the rear of the neighboring property, grateful for the accessibility modifications he had made to his wheelchair several months earlier. The all-terrain wheels, with enhanced grip and stability, allowed him to navigate the uneven ground between properties with minimal noise, while the reinforced frame supported his movement over landscape features that would have stopped a standard medical chair. The Decker residence stood dark, except for a single upstairs window where fluctuating light suggested a television was on. Jackson positioned himself beside the back door, listening intently. The specialized training he had received in battlefield, acoustic monitoring, had become unexpectedly valuable in civilian life, his hearing having developed heightened sensitivity to compensate for his physical limitations. Through the door, he detected the unmistakable sounds of conflict. A heavy object falling, a muffled cry quickly silenced, the distinctive cadence of threatening speech too quiet to discern specific words. Years of experience in violence assessment left no doubt about what was occurring inside. Jackson verified his phone was recording, activated the emergency GPS beacon on his own service vest, and made a decision that would irrevocably alter multiple lives. Using the reinforced frame of his wheelchair as a battering implement, he struck the door's locking mechanism with calculated force, breaking through on the second impact. Inside, the scene confirmed his worst expectations. Raymond Decker stood over his son, who was curled defensively on the kitchen floor, a broken plate scattered in pieces nearby. Decker's posture displayed the universal characteristics of an aggressor interrupted, momentary shock transitioning rapidly to defensive aggression. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Decker demanded, his hand still raised from whatever action Jackson's entry had interrupted. The man's uniform, shirt hung on a nearby chair, the courthouse security insignia visible on its shoulder. Jackson positioned his wheelchair to block the doorway, his voice carrying the command presence that had once directed Marines in combat situations. "Step away from your son." "This is breaking and entering," Decker snarled, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the police. You've got about 2 minutes before you're arrested, cripple." Jackson's expression remained impassive at the slur, his focus entirely on Ethan, who had used the distraction to scramble behind a counter. The boy's face showed fresh bruising, his lip split and bleeding. More telling was his behavior, the practiced movements of someone who had learned exactly where to position himself to minimize exposure to further attack. "Ethan," Jackson said, maintaining visual contact with Decker while addressing the child, "red or green?" The code was one they had established during their brief interactions over the past 3 days, a simple communication system borrowed from military protocols. Red meant immediate danger requiring intervention. Green meant the situation was manageable. "Red," Ethan whispered, the single syllable containing volumes of fear and desperation. Decker's eyes narrowed with dangerous recognition. "You've been talking to my kid? Filling his head with nonsense?" His posture shifted subtly, weight transferring to the balls of his feet, the unconscious preparation for physical aggression that Jackson had observed in countless confrontations. "Sentinel, attend!" Jackson called, his voice pitched to carry to the yard where the dog waited. "A dog?" Decker laughed harshly. "You think that's going to scare me? I deal with canine units at the courthouse every day." The Belgian Malinois appeared, in the doorway, moving with silent precision to position himself between Jackson and Decker. Unlike the courthouse security dogs Decker might have encountered, Sentinel displayed none of the overt aggression of typical protection training. There were no bared teeth, no growling, no aggressive posture, just focused, controlled attention and perfect positioning. "You're making a mistake," Decker said, his voice lowering to a threatening register as he reached slowly toward a drawer behind him. "I have friends in the department. This will be your word against mine, a disturbed veteran with PTSD breaking into a security officer's home. Who do you think they'll believe?" Jackson recognized the calculated adjustment in Decker's approach, the shift from aggression to intimidation that suggested experience manipulating perceptions and systems. The drawer likely contained a weapon, its placement suggesting habitual access. "Sentinel, secure," Jackson commanded. The dog moved with explosive speed, crossing the distance to Decker before the man could complete his reach. Instead of attacking, Sentinel performed the precise containment maneuver he had been trained for, a controlled body block that disrupted balance without causing injury, followed by a positioning that effectively pinned Decker against the counter without applying teeth. The technique represented thousands of hours of specialized training, combining military working dog protocols with service dog precision. The adaptation had been developed specifically to address Jackson's need for security without aggression. In his post-military life, a necessity given his physical limitations. What had begun as personal protection training had evolved into something far more nuanced. Decker froze, experiencing the disorienting realization that comes from encountering expertise beyond one's comprehension. The dog's control was absolute, but measured, demonstrating a level of training that transcended standard canine capabilities. "I've activated emergency services," Jackson stated, holding up his phone to show the active call. "Everything since I entered has been recorded and transmitted to secure cloud storage. Multiple agencies have been notified through the Veterans Emergency Response System." This wasn't entirely accurate. The system was designed for veterans, in crisis, not for intervening in child abuse situations, but the calculated bluff leveraged Decker's limited understanding of military protocols. The recording, however, was genuine and would prove crucial in the events that followed. "Ethan," Jackson continued, maintaining the calm, authoritative tone that had steadied countless Marines in crisis situations. "I need you to collect essential items, whatever is important to you that can fit in a backpack. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, moving with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency evacuations. This familiar response to crisis. Instructions told its own story about the household dynamics. Decker's expression darkened further. "You can't take my son. That's kidnapping." "It's emergency extraction of a minor from imminent danger," Jackson corrected, the legal terminology precise and deliberate. "Authorized under State Code 37-529 when evidence of abuse is present and continuing threat exists." This citation of legal code, something Jackson had researched extensively during his preparations for possible intervention, visibly unsettled Decker. Like many who used institutional connections to facilitate abuse, he had expected legal intimidation to work in his favor, not against him. 4 minutes later, police sirens announced the arrival of responding officers. The situation escalated rapidly into a complex legal entanglement that would continue for months. Emergency custody hearings, temporary placement orders, contradictory testimony from character witnesses for Decker, and the slow grinding machinery of a system designed with numerous procedural safeguards that often delayed substantive protection. Throughout the process, Jackson maintained his military discipline, providing testimony with factual precision, documenting each interaction, and leveraging every resource available through his veteran support network. He never raised his voice in court proceedings, never displayed emotion when Decker's colleagues testified to his exemplary professional character, never visibly reacted to insinuations about his own mental stability following combat trauma. But the system that Jackson had trusted to function properly, once presented with clear evidence, began to show the same fractures and failures he had witnessed in other contexts. Decker's connections within the courthouse created subtle procedural advantages, hearing schedules that accommodated his work commitments while ignoring Ethan's school schedule, evidence submissions that were mysteriously delayed in processing, and witness testimony that received varying levels of judicial attention. 3 months after the initial intervention, following multiple hearings and psychiatric evaluations, the case reached its most critical juncture. Despite substantial documentation of abuse, including medical evidence and Ethan's consistent testimony, the court appeared to be moving toward a supervised reunification plan that would eventually return Ethan to his father's custody. The evening before the final disposition hearing, Jackson sat in his adapted home office, reviewing every document, transcript, and procedural note from the case with the same methodical thoroughness he had once applied to mission planning. Sentinel lay beside his wheelchair, maintaining the attentive vigilance that never fully abated even in moments of apparent rest. Something in the documentation had been nagging at Jackson's tactical instincts, a pattern not immediately obvious, but persistently troubling. He spread the hearing transcripts across his specially designed workspace, applying the same analytical methods he had used to identify insurgent movement patterns in seemingly random field reports. The breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m. when Jackson identified a subtle inconsistency in Decker's testimony about his whereabouts on specific dates. Cross-referencing these with Ethan's medical records revealed a pattern. Ethan's accidents requiring medical attention occurred consistently on Decker's scheduled days off, never on work days documented in his courthouse security logs. This wasn't merely suggestive evidence. It was a definitive behavioral pattern that contradicted Decker's carefully constructed narrative of random childhood injuries occurring during normal play activities. More significantly, it demonstrated premeditation, the calculated timing of abuse to avoid professional scrutiny. Jackson immediately contacted his veterans advocacy lawyer, transmitting the analysis and supporting documentation. Their subsequent conversation lasted only 7 minutes, but established a critical tactical approach for the upcoming hearing, one that would bypass traditional witness examination in favor of a more direct demonstration. What neither of them could have anticipated was how this approach would ultimately manifest in that decisive courtroom moment when a specific hand signal would initiate a sequence of events that even the most experienced legal professionals present had never witnessed before. As dawn broke the morning of the hearing, Jackson allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The parallels between this suburban legal battle and his military operations were more numerous than he had initially recognized. Both involved systems designed with noble intentions that sometimes failed in execution. Both required navigation of complex bureaucracies while maintaining focus on the fundamental mission, and both ultimately came down to the same essential principle: protecting those who could not protect themselves, regardless of the personal cost. With that clarity of purpose, Jackson prepared for what would become the most significant deployment of his and Sentinel's specialized capabilities, not on a distant battlefield, but in the seemingly civilized confines of the Jefferson County Courthouse. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood as a monument to classical judicial architecture, its limestone facade and imposing columns projecting an aura of impartial authority. On the morning of the final disposition hearing, Jackson arrived 90 minutes before the scheduled start time, navigating his wheelchair through the employee entrance where accessibility accommodations were superior to the public options. This route, legally available to him through Americans with Disabilities Act provisions, also allowed him to avoid the growing media presence at the main entrance. The case had attracted unexpected attention following a local reporter's investigation into the pattern of procedural anomalies that had characterized the proceedings. The resulting article, while carefully avoiding direct accusations of impropriety, had raised questions about the intersection of professional courtesies and judicial objectivity when courthouse employees became litigants in the very system where they worked. Jackson proceeded through security with practiced efficiency, the specialized clearance for his service animal streamlining what might otherwise have been a complicated process. Sentinel moved beside him with the perfect positioning that reflected thousands of hours of training, maintaining the precise distance that allowed for mobility while remaining instantly available for assistance. Their arrival at Courtroom 3B occurred as the space was still being prepared for the day's proceedings. The bailiff, a veteran himself who had developed a professional respect for Jackson over the course of the hearings, acknowledged him with a brief nod. "Sergeant Reeves," he said, using the military title as a courtesy. "You're early today." Jackson nodded, his voice measured to conserve energy for the proceedings ahead. Needed to check the accessibility setup. This wasn't his actual reason for arriving early, but it provided a plausible explanation for his presence during the pre-hearing preparations. His true purpose was observation, specifically observation of Raymond Decker's interactions with courthouse personnel before the formal proceedings began. Throughout the case, Jackson had noticed subtle differences in how Decker was treated. Compared to standard litigants, today's early arrival had confirmed his suspicions. The familiar greetings from security staff, the casual conversations with clerks, the easy access to restricted areas normally inaccessible to civilian participants. These weren't necessarily signs of corruption, but they demonstrated an institutional familiarity that created inherent advantages. Jackson positioned his wheelchair in the designated accessibility space at the front of the gallery, using the vantage point to observe the gradually filling courtroom. His military training in environmental assessment had become second nature, categorizing entrance by body language, interaction patterns, and positioning choices. Defense attorney Martin Geller arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled start. His perpetually disorganized approach to case management evident in the overflowing briefcase and harried expression. Despite these superficial impressions, Jackson had developed a grudging respect for Geller's unexpected persistence in the face of institutional resistance. "We received the analysis you sent over," Geller said, keeping his voice low as he arranged materials at the defense table. "Compelling pattern recognition. Did you develop that skill in the military?" "Intelligence analysis," Jackson confirmed with characteristic economy of words. "Pattern identification in seemingly random incidents." Geller nodded thoughtfully. "It could be persuasive, but timing patterns alone won't overcome the character testimonials Decker has lined up. Judge Carlton has already ruled against admitting the broader behavioral analysis without expert testimony to support it." Jackson had anticipated this procedural hurdle. The justice system's dependence on credentialed expertise often disadvantaged those whose knowledge came from practical experience rather than academic certification. It was a limitation he had encountered repeatedly during his veterans' advocacy work. "Alternate approach prepared," he assured Geller, deliberately avoiding specifics that might place the attorney in an ethically compromising position. Some strategies were better implemented without prior notification, allowing for plausible deniability if procedural questions arose later. The courtroom gradually filled with the usual participants in the drama that had unfolded over months of hearings. Social workers from Child Protective Services arrived with their standardized assessments and careful, politically neutral language. Court-appointed psychological evaluators brought their clinical observations couched in diagnostic terminology that often obscured, rather than clarified, the fundamental issues at stake. Character witnesses for both sides waited with prepared statements emphasizing either Decker's professional reliability or Jackson's military service record, depending on their allegiance. Notably absent was Ethan himself. The court had determined that his presence during testimony about his abuse would be potentially traumatizing, a decision Jackson couldn't dispute despite his concerns about the boy's voice being literally removed from proceedings determining his future. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Raymond Decker made his entrance, accompanied by prosecutor Elaine Mercer. His appearance had been carefully crafted for maximum sympathetic impact. Conservative suit suggesting respectability without ostentation, subdued, tie indicating seriousness, and the subtle addition of a silver pin representing 10 years of courthouse security service. The calculated nature of this presentation wasn't lost on Jackson, who had observed similar attention to impression management among individuals attempting to influence high-value targets in Afghanistan. Judge Carlton entered at 9:45 a.m. and the formal proceedings began with the ritualistic announcements and procedural acknowledgments that characterize the American legal system. The initial testimonies followed predictable patterns, with Decker's colleagues emphasizing his professional reliability and Jackson's veterans advocate highlighting his exemplary service record. The critical shift occurred when Decker himself took the stand. Unlike previous hearings where his testimony had been carefully structured by the prosecutor's questions, today's examination allowed for more extensive narrative responses. This change in approach, likely intended to humanize Decker before the final decision, created unexpected vulnerabilities. "Mr. Decker," began Prosecutor Mercer, "could you describe your relationship with your son prior to these allegations?" Decker leaned slightly forward, his expression modulated to convey earnest concern. "Ethan and I have always been close, especially after his mother left. I've been both mother and father to him, trying to balance discipline with understanding. It hasn't been easy as a single parent working full-time in law enforcement, but everything I've done has been to provide stability and structure. And the injuries that have been discussed in these proceedings, kids get hurt playing. It's normal," Decker replied, his voice taking on the slightly condescending tone of someone explaining the obvious. "Ethan is an active boy who's had his share of accidents. Falls from his bike, sports injuries at school, the typical bumps and bruises of childhood. What's not normal is a disturbed veteran breaking into our home, frightening my son, and using a military attack dog to threaten me when I tried to protect my family." The calculated framing of events, casting Jackson as the dangerous aggressor and himself as the protective father, was skillfully executed. Jackson observed the subtle nods among some jury members, the expected response to a narrative that aligned with common societal perceptions about combat veterans and PTSD. During cross-examination, Geller attempted to introduce the pattern analysis Jackson had identified, but Judge Carlton sustained the prosecution's objection regarding lack of expert certification. This procedural setback had been anticipated, necessitating the alternate approach Jackson had prepared. The defense strategy shifted to establishing inconsistencies in Decker's timeline of events on the night of the intervention. Geller methodically walked through the sequence, deliberately, creating opportunities for Decker to reinforce his version of events in specific detail. "You testified that you were simply helping Ethan clean up a plate he had accidentally broken when Sergeant Reeves illegally entered your home. Is that correct?" "That's exactly what happened," Decker confirmed, his confidence growing as he navigated what appeared to be routine questioning. "The boy was upset about breaking one of his mother's plates, and I was comforting him when suddenly this man crashed through my back door with his dog. And prior to that, Ethan had been watching television upstairs. Yes, it was a school night. He'd finished his homework and had an hour of TV time before bed." "What was he watching?" Decker hesitated briefly, the first crack in his composed facade. "I don't micromanage his viewing habits. Something appropriate for his age." "But the television was in your bedroom, correct?" the only television showing activity that night, according to Sergeant Reeves' testimony. He comes into my room sometimes when he has trouble sleeping, Decker explained, the response clearly improvised. He finds it comforting. The questioning continued in this seemingly innocent pattern, gradually establishing specific details about household routines that would become critical contextual information. Throughout this process, Jackson remained impassively observant, noting subtle indicators of increasing tension in Decker's posture and vocal patterns, the slightly elevated pitch, accelerated speech rate, and minimal fluctuations in eye contact that signaled cognitive load associated with deception. When Sentinel suddenly raised his head beside Jackson's wheelchair, the motion was so subtle that only those specifically watching the dog would have noticed. The Belgian Malinois made no sound, but his posture shifted from relaxed attentiveness to focused alertness, his ears oriented forward and body tensing almost imperceptibly. Jackson recognized the signal immediately. Sentinel had detected something significant. The dog's advanced scent detection capabilities, originally trained for identifying explosives and later refined for medical alert purposes, had registered a stimulus of interest. Given the context and timing, Jackson made an immediate tactical assessment and decision. The moment came during a procedural pause when Judge Carlton was reviewing submitted documentation. Without drawing attention, Jackson made a subtle hand signal, different from the one he would later use for the critical revelation, but part of the same specialized communication system. This preliminary signal instructed Sentinel to verify and confirm the initial alert, a protocol developed during their military deployment to eliminate false positives in high-consequence scenarios. Sentinel's response was a barely perceptible shift in ear position, the canine equivalent of confirmed intelligence. Whatever the dog had detected was consistent and significant. Jackson immediately made eye contact with Geller, giving a single, deliberate nod, their prearranged signal to implement the alternative strategy they had discussed that morning. The attorney's momentary widening of eyes indicated reception of the message, though his professional composure quickly returned as he reorganized his notes to adjust the questioning sequence. "Your Honor," Geller addressed the judge, "the defense would like to introduce a demonstrative exhibit related to Mr. Decker's testimony about the events of April 17th. Judge Carlton looked up from the documents with mild surprise. "No demonstrative exhibits were listed in your pretrial submissions, Counselor." "This relates specifically to testimony that has just been presented, Your Honor. It's demonstrative of the timeline Mr. Decker has established under oath. Says you can to still." After a moment's consideration, Judge Carlton nodded. "I'll allow it with the understanding that the prosecution may object to specific elements if they exceed the scope of direct testimony." This judicial decision, seemingly routine procedural management, opened the precise pathway Jackson had anticipated would be necessary for what would follow. The tactical patience that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments now served a different but equally crucial purpose in this civilian battlefield. As Geller began setting up what appeared to be a timeline display, Jackson caught Sentinel's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The dog maintained perfect discipline, his heightened alertness evident only in the focused intensity of his gaze as they prepared for what would become the decisive moment in these proceedings. What no one in the courtroom yet realized was that Jackson and Sentinel had identified something during their meticulous preparation that would transcend procedural maneuvering and character testimony. Physical evidence that could not be explained away by institutional connections or professional courtesy. Evidence that would ultimately give Ethan the justice that procedural safeguards had thus far failed to secure. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted subtly as Geller arranged his timeline display on an easel facing the witness stand. Raymond Decker maintained his composed demeanor, though micro-signals of tension manifested in his slightly elevated shoulder, posture, and the unconscious adjustment of his tie, stress indicators Jackson had been trained to recognize during high-stakes interrogations. From his positioned vantage point, Jackson observed the proceedings with tactical detachment, compartmentalizing emotional responses that might compromise strategic execution. This disciplined approach had served him through firefights in Helmand, province and IED detection missions in Kandahar. Now, it enabled him to navigate the equally treacherous terrain of a judicial system where procedural adherence often superseded substantive justice. "Mr. Decker," Geller began, gesturing toward the timeline, "you've testified that on the evening of April 17th, Ethan was watching television in your bedroom before accidentally breaking a plate in the kitchen, at which point Sergeant Reeves illegally entered your home. Is that sequence accurate?" "Yes, that's exactly what happened," Decker confirmed, his confidence seemingly reinforced by the straightforward nature of the question. "And this television viewing occurred approximately when?" "Around 9:30 p.m. His bedtime is 10 Tues on school nights." Geller nodded, making a notation on the timeline. "During direct examination, you mentioned that the plate Ethan broke was one of his mother's. Could you elaborate on the significance of that particular plate?" The question appeared innocuous, a humanizing detail that might generate sympathy, but Jackson recognized it as the strategic entry point they had carefully constructed during case preparation. Decker's expression softened into practiced sentimentality. It was part of a set his mother received as a wedding gift from her grandmother, one of the few meaningful items she left behind when she abandoned us. Ethan knows how important those plates are to our family history. And where were these plates kept? In the china cabinet in the dining room. They're not for everyday use. Geller approached the witness stand, maintaining casual professionalism. So, to clarify the sequence, Ethan was watching television upstairs, came downstairs to the dining room where he removed a plate from the china cabinet, then dropped it in the kitchen where you were comforting him when Sergeant Reeves entered. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right," Decker confirmed, though a subtle tightening around his eyes suggested growing awareness that the questioning had a specific direction. "Your Honor," Geller addressed the judge, "the defense would like to introduce surveillance footage from Mr. Decker's home security system showing the exterior and kitchen areas on the night in question." Prosecutor Mercer rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence wasn't included in pretrial disclosures." "It was included, Your Honor," Geller countered, "in the supplemental filing dated May 7th. The prosecution acknowledged receipt in their responsive motion. Judge Carlton reviewed the relevant documentation before rendering her decision." "Objection. Overruled. The evidence was properly disclosed, though I note it was buried in extensive supplementary materials." "Proceed, Counselor, but keep it focused on relevant testimony." This procedural victory represented weeks of strategic preparation. The security footage had been legally obtained through discovery processes, but intentionally positioned within voluminous documentation where its significance might be overlooked during routine prosecution review. As the video began playing on the courtroom's display system, Jackson noted Decker's micro-expressions of alarm, the momentary widening of eyes and involuntary swallow that signaled recognition of potential exposure. The footage showed time-stamped exterior views of the Decker residence from 9:00 p.m. until Jackson's arrival at 11:47 p.m., conspicuously revealing no sign of Ethan outside the house during this period. "Mr. Decker," Geller continued, "your testimony indicates Ethan was watching television in your bedroom at 9:30 p.m., correct?" "Yes, that's right." "Then please explain this portion of the footage." The video shifted to interior kitchen surveillance, showing Decker entering at 9:27 p.m., opening a cabinet where dishes were stored, removing a plate, and deliberately breaking it against the counter. The audio captured his voice clearly. "Get down here now! Look what you made me do!" The courtroom fell silent as the footage continued, showing Ethan reluctantly entering the kitchen at 9:29 p.m., visibly trembling as Decker grabbed his arm and forced him to kneel beside the broken pieces. The subsequent 2 minutes of footage directly contradicted every element of Decker's sworn testimony about the events preceding Jackson's intervention. "Objection!" Prosecutor Mercer stood abruptly. "This footage has clearly been edited or altered." "The defense anticipated this concern, Your Honor," Geller responded calmly. "We've submitted the complete footage for forensic authentication by an independent laboratory. Their certification of authenticity is included in the documentation previously provided to the court." Judge Carlton's expression had transformed from judicial neutrality to focused intensity. "Mr. Decker, you've testified under oath to a version of events that appears directly contradicted by your own security footage. Would you care to explain this discrepancy?" Decker's calculated composure fractured entirely. "That's not... The system must have malfunctioned or been hacked. That man," he pointed accusingly at Jackson, "has military cybersecurity training. He could have easily tampered with the footage." "The certification specifically addresses potential tampering," Geller noted. "The authentication includes verification that the footage has remained unaltered since initial recording." "No." As the legal implications of perjury became increasingly apparent, Decker's demeanor shifted from defensive to aggressive. "This is a setup. A disturbed veteran with a vendetta against authority figures. Everyone knows what PTSD does to these people's perception of reality. This tactical pivot toward attacking Jackson's credibility wasn't unexpected. Throughout the proceedings, Decker had consistently employed stereotypes about combat veterans to undermine testimony, contradicting his narrative. The strategy had proven effective in previous hearings, particularly with jurors lacking direct exposure to military service members. What Decker couldn't have anticipated was how thoroughly Jackson had prepared for this moment. Military operations had taught him the essential principle of redundant intelligence, never relying on a single source of information when mission success was critical. "Your Honor," Geller addressed the court again, "the defense has additional evidence relevant to Mr. Decker's testimony and credibility." Judge Carlton, visibly troubled by the surveillance footage, nodded her permission. "Proceed, Counselor." "The defense calls for a brief demonstration involving Sergeant Reeves's service animal, which relates directly to evidence collected during the incident in question." This request triggered immediate objection from the prosecution, initiating a procedural sidebar discussion that Jackson had anticipated as a necessary hurdle. While the attorneys and judge engaged in their private consultation, he maintained perfect stillness, conserving energy and focus for the critical sequence to follow. Judge Carlton returned from the sidebar with her decision. "I'll allow a limited demonstration, provided it relates specifically to evidence collection relevant to this case. The court notes for the record that Sentinel is a certified service animal with specialized training, not merely a pet." This judicial acknowledgement of Sentinel's professional status represented another carefully constructed legal foundation, laid through previous hearings, where Jackson had methodically established the dog's credentials, training certifications, and specialized capabilities. "Your Honor," Geller continued, "during the incident on April 17th, when Sergeant Reeves responded to Ethan's emergency alert, Sentinel performed a standard evidence preservation procedure he was trained to execute during Sergeant Reeves's military service. This training was specifically adapted for his service animal role following Sergeant Reeves's injury. "What evidence are you referring to, Counselor?" Judge Carlton asked. "A child's personal item recovered from the scene, which subsequent DNA testing has confirmed contains both Ethan's blood and epithelial cells from Mr. Decker. The defense would like to demonstrate Sentinel's evidence recognition capability to establish chain of custody and collection methodology." Judge Carlton considered this request with the careful deliberation that had characterized her oversight throughout the proceedings. "I'll allow it, with the understanding that any theatrical elements will result in immediate termination of the demonstration." This ruling created the precise opening Jackson had methodically worked toward throughout months of hearings and procedural maneuvering. With Decker's credibility already compromised by the video evidence, this demonstration would establish not only the physical evidence of abuse, but the pattern of similar incidents that had previously been ruled inadmissible through conventional testimony. Jackson made eye contact with Geller, who nodded almost imperceptibly before addressing the court again. "Your Honor, we've placed several items in numbered evidence bags on the table before the bench. These include the recovered hair clip along with similar items that have no connection to this case. We request permission for Sentinel to demonstrate his evidence recognition capability under Sergeant Reeves' direction." After receiving judicial approval, Jackson wheeled himself to a position with clear sightlines to both the evidence table and Decker on the witness stand. What happened next would depend entirely on the specialized communication system he and Sentinel had developed during their military service and refined throughout their rehabilitation. The critical moment had arrived. Jackson made the distinctive hand signal, thumb tucked against palm, index and ring fingers extended, middle and pinky fingers curled inward, that activated Sentinel's evidence identification protocol. The command contained multiple layers of information comprehensible only to an animal with thousands of hours of specialized training. Identify evidence associated with the subject under surveillance. Distinguish items with specific biological markers. Maintain disciplined, non-aggressive approach. Sentinel rose with the fluid precision that characterized all his movements, advancing toward the evidence table with focused attention. The courtroom watched in tense silence as the dog systematically examined each bagged item, his trained scent discrimination abilities allowing him to identify specific biological markers through the sealed containers. After methodical inspection, Sentinel indicated the third bag, which contained the purple butterfly hair clip recovered from Decker's residence. This confirmation established the chain of evidence Jackson had documented on the night of intervention. What no one except Jackson had anticipated was Sentinel's subsequent behavior. Rather than returning to his handler's side as expected, the dog turned deliberately toward Decker, his attention suddenly focused on the witness with unexpected intensity. Jackson immediately recognized the alert posture that indicated Sentinel had detected a relevant scent signature, the same biological markers present on the evidence item. This development suggested Decker was currently carrying something with similar evidentiary value. The courtroom dynamics shifted instantly. Decker's expression transformed from defensive antagonism to visible alarm as Sentinel approached the witness stand with the same controlled purpose he had demonstrated at the evidence table. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Mercer objected, "this goes beyond the approved demonstration." Judge Carlton raised her hand slightly. "The court will observe where this leads before ruling. Bailiff, please remain alert, but do not interfere unless I direct otherwise." Sentinel stopped directly before Decker, his behavior exhibiting none of the aggressive characteristics typical of police canine units. Instead, his focus remained entirely on his detection objective, identifying a source of evidentiary scent without intimidation tactics. Decker pressed back in his chair, visible anxiety replacing his previous confidence. "Control your animal," he demanded, his voice strained. Jackson made no move to intervene, allowing Sentinel to complete his trained response. Sequence. The dog's attention fixed on Decker's suit jacket pocket, from which he had detected a scent signature matching the evidence markers present on Ethan's previously recovered hair clip. What followed unfolded with the precision of expertly executed military operations. Sentinel placed his muzzle against Decker's pocket, applying gentle pressure that caused the object inside to become visible. With surgical delicacy, he extracted a small purple butterfly bracelet, the matching accessory to the hair clip already entered into evidence, bearing similar stains consistent with dried blood. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Sentinel placed the item carefully on the floor before the witness stand, then returned to Jackson's side with disciplined professionalism. The demonstration had revealed not only evidence of abuse, but Decker's disturbing pattern of retaining trophies from his assaults, a behavioral signature characteristic of predatory personalities that Jackson had identified through his pattern analysis. Judge Carlton found her voice first. "Mr. Decker, do you wish to explain why you are carrying what appears to be a child's blood-stained bracelet in your pocket while testifying in these proceedings?" Decker's composed facade had completely disintegrated. I don't know how that got there. This is some kind of setup. That dog was obviously trained to plant evidence. The desperation in this accusation undermined any remaining credibility Decker might have maintained. Judge Carlton's expression reflected the shift in judicial perspective that would ultimately determine the case's outcome. "Bailiff," she instructed, "please secure that item as evidence. Mr. Decker will remain in custody pending investigation of perjury charges and review of all evidence related to the abuse allegations." As procedural directives continued, Jackson maintained his characteristic stillness, acknowledging Sentinel's performance with only the slightest touch on the dog's head. The culmination of months of strategic preparation, evidence compilation, and procedural navigation had finally created the breakthrough that conventional channels had failed to achieve. What this moment represented transcended the specific case or even Ethan's individual protection. It demonstrated how specialized capabilities developed for warfare could be precisely adapted to navigate civilian systems when those systems failed their most vulnerable participants. The justice unfolding in that courtroom had required exactly the same elements that had defined Jackson's military service: disciplined patience, strategic thinking, precise execution, and unwavering commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity in the days following what local media had dubbed the Sentinel Revelation. Judge Carlton's courtroom decision had set in motion a cascade of legal proceedings, extending far beyond Ethan's case. The discovery of the matching butterfly accessories, both bearing Ethan's blood and Decker's DNA, had triggered a comprehensive review of similar cases throughout the county, particularly those involving courthouse employees or their associates. 3 days after the dramatic courtroom demonstration, Jackson sat in his adapted living room, reviewing documentation from the emergency custody hearing that had formally removed Ethan from Decker's guardianship. The comprehensive order included provisions for trauma-informed therapeutic intervention, educational support, and temporary placement with a specially trained foster family experienced in helping children recover from abuse. The doorbell's distinctive chime interrupted his review. Through the security camera feed displayed on his tablet, Jackson identified Elena Chambers, the Child Protective Services caseworker who'd been assigned to Ethan's case following the initial intervention. "Sergeant Reeves," she greeted him. When he opened the door, her professional demeanor softened by genuine respect. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but there's a situation that requires immediate attention." Jackson gestured her inside, wheeling himself to the living area where case files remained organized on his adaptive workstation. Sentinel acknowledged the familiar visitor with a brief tail motion before resuming his vigilant positioning. "Ethan?" Jackson asked, his economical speech pattern conveying both question and concern. "He's physically safe," Elena assured him, taking a seat at his invitation. "But there's been a significant development. The foster placement is proving problematic, not through any fault of the family. Ethan is experiencing severe anxiety and attachment difficulties specific to his circumstances." Jackson nodded once, understanding the unspoken implications. Children who experienced long-term abuse often developed complex trauma responses that manifested in seemingly contradictory behaviors, simultaneously needing security while rejecting attachment figures, craving stability while sabotaging structure. "He's refusing to speak to his therapist or foster parents," Eleanor continued. "The only person he's asked for repeatedly is you." This information wasn't entirely surprising. The intense circumstances of their initial connection had created a unique relationship foundation. Jackson had been the first adult to believe Ethan unconditionally, to take concrete action despite institutional obstacles, and to demonstrate protection without subsequent abandonment. "I've arranged therapeutic visitation," Eleanor explained. "But his case team believes more consistent contact might be necessary for his stabilization. The problem is, our system doesn't have a procedural category for your relationship to Ethan. You're not a relative, former teacher, or recognized community support person under standard protocols." Jackson recognized the bureaucratic impasse immediately. Systems designed to protect vulnerable children necessarily restricted access to authorized individuals with clearly defined roles. His unique position, intervention agent without formal designation, created a classification challenge for an institution dependent on established categories. "What does Ethan need?" Jackson asked, focusing on practicalities rather than procedural limitations. Elena's professional reserve softened slightly. In his words, he needs to be where Sentinel is because they know how to make the bad stuff stop. His trauma response has fixed on you and Sentinel as his primary security figures. This psychological attachment mechanism was familiar to Jackson from both military experience and his veterans' support work. When standard safety systems failed, trauma survivors often bonded intensely with whoever provided effective protection during crisis. It wasn't personal attachment so much as survival-based trust, the recognition of demonstrated capability rather than promised protection. "Options?" he prompted. Elena hesitated briefly before responding. "There are several possibilities, none of them straightforward. Temporary therapeutic visitation is already approved, but his case team believes something more substantial may be necessary for his psychological stabilization." She removed a folder from her briefcase, opening it to reveal official documentation. "I've prepared the paperwork for several potential arrangements, from emergency respite care to specialized foster placement. The most direct option would be kinship-adjacent emergency certification, which would allow Ethan to be placed here temporarily, while longer-term arrangements are evaluated." Jackson studied the documents, immediately identifying the procedural adaptations Elena had implemented to create this non-standard pathway. The kinship-adjacent designation was typically reserved for godparents or long-term family friends without biological relation, a category Jackson didn't technically fit. But that could be justified under emergency circumstances, given the unique nature of his involvement. This arrangement would require immediate home adaptation for a child resident, Elena continued, including bedroom furnishings, appropriate nutrition planning, and educational transportation arrangements. Given your mobility considerations, Additional support services would be required. The department can provide resources for these modifications. Jackson processed this information with the same tactical assessment he applied to all complex scenarios. The proposed arrangement presented significant logistical challenges. His home was designed for a single adult with specific accessibility needs. His daily routine optimized for his physical limitations, his professional obligations structured around personal recovery priorities. "There's no obligation to take this on," Elena added, recognizing his deliberation. "We can explore other options that would still allow therapeutic contact without full residential responsibility." Jackson wheeled himself to the window overlooking his precisely maintained yard, considering implications beyond immediate logistics. His post-military life had been carefully constructed to minimize complications and dependencies, a controlled environment that supported his physical recovery while protecting against the psychological vulnerabilities that combat trauma had created. Introducing a traumatized child into this carefully balanced system would disrupt every aspect of that control. It would require not just physical adaptations to his home, but fundamental recalibration of the boundaries he had established. Between his military past and civilian present. "Timeline?" he asked, turning back to Elena. "Immediate placement would be optimal. Ethan's current destabilization is escalating daily. The foster family is managing as effectively as possible, but his psychological needs exceed standard placement protocols." The urgency wasn't surprising. Trauma responses often followed progressive intensification patterns when stabilization interventions proved insufficient. The window for effective intervention was limited, particularly for children whose developing neurological systems were still forming permanent response patterns. 24 hours, Jackson decided, his damaged voice carrying quiet certainty. For home preparation. Elena's relief was evident despite her professional composure. "The department can provide emergency furnishings and adaptation assistance. I'll coordinate with support services immediately." As she gathered the necessary documentation for his signature, Jackson found himself confronting an unexpected parallel to his military experience. Special operations had often required rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, immediate mission recalibration when intelligence revealed new priorities. The same tactical flexibility that had made him an effective combat leader was now being called upon in an entirely different context, but with similar underlying principles. "Sergeant Reeves," Elena said as she prepared to leave, "I should mention that this arrangement will require regular home visits, progress documentation, and participation in Ethan's therapeutic program. The department recognizes your unique qualifications, but standard monitoring protocols remain mandatory." Jackson nodded his understanding. System requirements were system requirements, regardless of individual circumstances. He had navigated military bureaucracy successfully for years. Child welfare protocols represented a different administrative language, but similar structural principles. After Elena's departure, Jackson remained motionless for several minutes, processing the implications of the commitment he had just made. Then, with the same methodical approach he applied to all operations, he began tactical planning, creating necessary modifications to his environment, schedule, and resources to accommodate this unexpected mission parameter. The spare bedroom, currently functioning as an equipment storage area for his physical therapy apparatus, would require complete reconfiguration. The kitchen would need restocking, with appropriate nutrition options for a growing child. Daily schedules would require adjustment to incorporate school transportation, homework supervision, and therapeutic appointments. Most significantly, Jackson recognized the need for psychological preparation. His post-military life had been deliberately structured to minimize unexpected variables and emotional complications. Taking responsibility for a traumatized child would introduce precisely the unpredictable elements he had carefully eliminated from his controlled environment. Sentinel approached as Jackson contemplated these challenges, placing his head on his handler's knee in the subtle support gesture he had been trained to provide during stress response episodes. The dog's intuitive understanding of emotional states transcended formal training protocols, representing the unique bond developed through shared trauma and recovery. "New mission parameters," Jackson told him, his hand resting on the dog's head. "Adaptation required." 27 hours later, Ethan arrived with minimal personal possessions: a backpack containing clothes, a worn stuffed animal missing one eye, and the specialized tablet provided by his therapy team for emotion tracking and communication exercises. His physical appearance had improved since their first encounter. The visible bruises had healed, proper nutrition had begun addressing his underweight condition, and appropriate medical care had resolved several untreated minor health issues. The psychological injuries remained starkly evident. Hypervigilance manifested in his constant environmental scanning, trauma bonding in his immediate gravitation toward Sentinel, and attachment disruption in his careful maintenance of physical distance from both adults during the transition briefing. When Elena prepared to leave after completing the placement documentation, Ethan's anxiety visibly intensified, body tension increasing, breathing patterns shifting, eye movement accelerating. These stress indicators triggered Sentinel's response without specific command, the dog moving to position himself alongside the boy with the same careful, non-threatening approach he used during Jackson's anxiety episodes. "Sentinel is specially trained," Jackson explained, noting Ethan's subtle relaxation as the dog established contact. "He recognizes when someone needs support." Ethan's hand moved hesitantly to Sentinel's fur, his first voluntary physical contact since arriving. "He remembers me?" "Service dogs never forget people they've helped," Jackson confirmed, modifying complex training concepts into understandable terms. "It's part of their job." This simple explanation seemed to stabilize something essential in Ethan's demeanor. As Elena departed with promises of follow-up within 48 hours, the boy maintained his connection to Sentinel, the physical contact appearing to anchor him during the transition stress. Jackson had prepared a carefully structured introduction to household systems, a modified version of military orientation protocols adapted for a child's comprehension. He demonstrated essential facilities, emergency procedures, and communication systems with the same methodical thoroughness he would have used for new squad members in a deployed environment. "Your space," he explained, showing Ethan the prepared bedroom. "Private territory, no entry without permission." The room had been transformed from utilitarian storage to functional living space, though without the decorative elements typical of children's bedrooms. Jackson had focused on security features and adaptive accessibility rather than aesthetic considerations. Blackout curtains for sleep regulation, nightlights with automated activation, communication system with direct connection to his room, and furniture arranged to eliminate hidden spaces that might trigger confinement trauma responses. Ethan surveyed the space with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to identifying potential threats in new environments. "No locks?" he asked, testing the bedroom door. "Security without confinement," Jackson explained. "Different approach." This philosophy, protection without imprisonment, represented Jackson's fundamental adaptation of military security protocols for civilian application. His specialized training had emphasized the psychological components of security as much as physical barriers. The understanding that perceived safety often proved more essential than technical containment measures. As evening approached, Jackson implemented the transitional routine recommended by Ethan's therapy team. consistent structure with built-in choice opportunities, clear expectations with flexibility for adaptation, and sensory regulation supports to address the hyperarousal typical of post-traumatic stress responses. The most significant challenge emerged at bedtime when Ethan's anxiety escalated to near panic levels, despite all preparatory measures. The therapeutic placement notes had documented severe night terrors and sleep disruption consistent with abuse-related trauma, but the intensity of his distress exceeded reported parameters. "Can't sleep in there," Ethan finally admitted, his voice barely audible. He always came at night. The simple statement contained volumes of traumatic context that required no elaboration. Jackson immediately recognized the security breach in his environmental preparation. He had addressed physical safety elements without sufficiently considering psychological safety requirements specific to abuse patterns. Without hesitation, Jackson implemented adaptive problem-solving, the same quick tactical recalibration that had kept his military unit alive through rapidly changing threat scenarios. "Alternate arrangement," he stated, wheeling himself to the hall closet where emergency supplies were stored. He removed a specialized sleeping mat designed for tactical deployment situations, lightweight, self-inflating, and thermally regulated for comfort in variable conditions. With Ethan's assistance, they established an alternative sleeping location in the living room, positioned with clear sightlines to both exit routes and Jackson's bedroom door, eliminating the isolation that had triggered the anxiety response. Most significantly, Jackson arranged for Sentinel to maintain guard position beside the sleeping area, implementing the same night security protocol the dog performed for his own sleep disturbance episodes. "Sentinel maintains watch," Jackson explained, as Ethan settled onto the mat. "Military protocol, nothing gets past him." This wasn't exaggeration, but documented capability. Sentinel's specialized training included sleep security maintenance, alertness, during handlers' vulnerable periods with graduated response protocols for different threat categories. This capability, developed for combat deployment and refined for post-injury support, now served an entirely different protective function. As Ethan finally relaxed into sleep, one hand maintaining contact with Sentinel's fur, Jackson observed the scene with complex recognition. The tactical adaptations required for this new mission would far exceed physical modifications or schedule adjustments. They would demand emotional resource allocation he had deliberately minimized in his carefully controlled post-military life. Yet as he watched the traumatized child find his first peaceful sleep in what had likely been years, Jackson recognized that the core mission parameters remained fundamentally unchanged from those that had defined his military service. Protect the vulnerable, adapt to evolving threats, and never abandon those who depend on your capabilities. The mission objectives had changed, but the underlying purpose remained the same. Different battlefield, same essential duty. 3 weeks into Ethan's placement, a routine began to establish itself within Jackson's home. Each day followed a carefully structured schedule that provided the predictability essential for trauma recovery while incorporating sufficient flexibility to prevent rigid control patterns that might mirror abusive dynamics. Mornings began with Jackson's adapted physical therapy routines, which Ethan initially observed from a distance, before gradually beginning to mimic certain exercises, a form of connection that required no verbal exchange or direct engagement. Breakfast followed a consistent protocol emphasizing nutritional requirements identified by Ethan's medical team: caloric density to address his underweight condition, balanced macronutrients to support developmental needs, and carefully introduced variety to expand his severely limited diet without triggering food anxieties common among abuse survivors. The school day provided a structured environment where Ethan's educational needs received specialized attention through an individualized education plan implemented by teachers briefed on his circumstances. Afternoons included therapeutic appointments, 3 times weekly, homework supervision, and what Jackson termed environmental reconnaissance, carefully planned outings designed to expand Ethan's comfort zone while maintaining security parameters. Throughout this developing routine, Sentinel served as the consistent bridge between them. The dog's specialized training created a triangulated communication system where direct interaction could be mediated through shared focus on Sentinel. When direct engagement proved overwhelming, this approach leveraged the established trauma bond Ethan had formed with Sentinel while gradually extending connection to Jackson through their shared relationship with the dog. Progress manifested in small but significant indicators. Ethan's increasing verbal communication, improved sleep patterns, and gradual reduction in hypervigilance behaviors. The child welfare assessment conducted at the 3-week mark documented measurable improvement across multiple developmental domains, though noted continuing concerns regarding emotional regulation and trust formation. What hadn't yet emerged was any substantive disclosure regarding the specific nature of the abuse Ethan had endured. His therapeutic sessions employed non-directive approaches appropriate for trauma processing, avoiding pressured disclosure while creating space for organic communication when psychological readiness developed. This therapeutic necessity sometimes conflicted with the ongoing legal proceedings, where prosecutorial timelines created pressure for detailed testimony. The catalyst for change arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday evening as Jackson reviewed case documentation at his adapted workstation. Ethan had completed his homework and was engaged in one of the structured play activities recommended by his therapy team. In this case, a tactical simulation game using miniature figures that allowed him to create scenarios where protective forces overcame threatening elements. "Did you get hurt in the war?" Ethan asked suddenly, his attention remaining on the figures rather than making direct eye contact, a communication strategy he often employed when approaching difficult topics. Jackson considered his response carefully, recognizing the importance of honest communication without overwhelming detail. "Yes, an explosion damaged my spine and vocal cords." Ethan arranged his play figures in a new defensive formation, processing this information. "Were you scared?" "Very scared," Jackson confirmed, recognizing the therapeutic opening this conversation provided. "Fear is the body's natural response to danger." The boy's hands stilled momentarily. "My dad said soldiers don't get scared, that only weak people get scared." "Your father was wrong," Jackson stated with quiet certainty. "Every Marine I served with experienced fear. The strongest ones acknowledged it instead of pretending." This simple contradiction of Decker's destructive narrative created visible impact. Ethan's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders relaxing from their habitually defensive position. "Sentinel got hurt too?" he asked, glancing at the dog resting nearby. "Yes, in the same explosion. Lost partial vision in one eye and has some scarring on his right side." Ethan absorbed this information with the serious contemplation that characterized his processing of significant concepts. "But you both still worked together, even though you got hurt." "We adapted," Jackson explained, "found new ways to use our capabilities." This framing, focusing on adaptation rather than limitation, represented a core principle of Jackson's post-injury rehabilitation philosophy. His military training had emphasized mission accomplishment through tactical flexibility. This same approach had guided his civilian recovery, focusing on capability reconfiguration rather than capability loss. Ethan rearranged his figures again, creating a protective formation with smaller figures sheltered within a perimeter of larger ones. Did you have nightmares after getting hurt? The question's clinical significance wasn't lost on Jackson. Ethan's severe sleep disturbances had improved with environmental modifications and Sentinel's presence, but night terrors continued to disrupt his sleep patterns several times weekly. Still do sometimes, Jackson acknowledged, maintaining factual honesty. Less often now. Therapeutic interventions and time help. Ethan nodded, seemingly reassured by this evidence that his own difficulties weren't unique or permanent. He continued his play activity for several minutes before asking his next question. Voice barely audible. Did someone hurt you on purpose? The layered meaning behind this question was immediately apparent. Ethan wasn't simply asking about combat injuries, but seeking to establish comparative context for his own experience, trying to determine whether Jackson could truly understand the specific trauma of intentional harm inflicted by someone with protective responsibility. The explosion was set deliberately, Jackson confirmed. Someone placed it knowing it would hurt others. He carefully maintained the conversational opening while allowing Ethan to control its progression, recognizing the therapeutic importance of self-directed disclosure, pacing. The boy remained focused on his figures, arranging and rearranging them in patterns that appeared to reflect internal processing. "My dad didn't just hit me," Ethan finally said, the words emerging with visible effort. "He did other things too." The simplicity of this statement belied its profound significance. It represented Ethan's first voluntary disclosure about the specific nature of his abuse, information he had thus far withheld, even in therapeutic settings with specialized trauma counselors. Jackson maintained careful neutrality in his response, providing space for continued disclosure without pressure. "I'm listening when you want to tell me." And what followed was a halting but progressive disclosure that revealed abuse patterns far more extensive than the physical violence documented in medical records. Ethan described systematic psychological manipulation, isolation tactics, and ritualized humiliation designed to prevent disclosure and ensure compliance. The methodology reflected calculated predatory behavior rather than impulsive aggression, a distinction with significant implications for both therapeutic intervention and prosecution strategy. Most disturbingly, Ethan revealed that his mother hadn't simply left, as Decker had claimed in court testimony. According to Ethan, she had threatened to report Decker's escalating violence, resulting in a final confrontation after which she simply disappeared. Ethan described being told she had abandoned them, but expressed doubt about this explanation based on her previous protective behaviors. Throughout this disclosure, Jackson maintained the careful listening presence he had developed during sensitive intelligence debriefings, creating space for comprehensive communication without directing its content, validating experiences without emotional reactivity that might interrupt the narrative flow. He recognized the profound trust this disclosure represented, particularly given Ethan's established pattern of withholding information from authority figures following systematic conditioning to expect disbelief. When Ethan finally fell silent, emotional exhaustion evident in his posture, Jackson acknowledged the significance of what had been shared. "Thank you for trusting me with your experience. That requires exceptional courage." The boy looked up, making rare direct eye contact. "Do you believe me? About my mom?" "Yes," Jackson responded without hesitation. "Your account is consistent with observable patterns." This simple validation, framed in the factual language Ethan had come to trust, rather than emotional reassurance he might dismiss, visibly released tension the boy had been carrying. For perhaps the first time, his disclosure had been received. with straightforward belief rather than skepticism or dismissal. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, the question encompassing far more than immediate next steps. Jackson recognized the multidimensional nature of this query. It addressed practical considerations regarding the new information, but more fundamentally sought reassurance about security and stability following a disclosure that previous conditioning had established as dangerous. "Several things," Jackson explained, maintaining the clear, direct communication that had proven effective. "This information needs to be shared with your therapy team and caseworker. It has implications for your protection plan and the ongoing legal proceedings." He paused, ensuring his next words registered fully. "Most importantly, sharing this information doesn't change your placement here. Security protocols remain in place. Your safety remains the primary mission objective." The deliberate use of military terminology, mission objectives, security protocols, provided reassurance through its association with structure and protection rather than emotional fragility. This approach had proven consistently effective in helping Ethan process complex situations that might otherwise trigger anxiety responses. "Can Sentinel sleep in my room tonight?" Ethan asked, the request revealing anticipated sleep disturbance following the emotional disclosure. "Affirmative," Jackson responded. "I'll adjust the duty rotation." This simple accommodation, framing the dog's support as operational reassignment rather than response to weakness, preserved Ethan's sense of agency while addressing his legitimate security concerns. It represented the balanced approach Jackson had developed, providing protection without reinforcing victimhood narratives. After Ethan had settled for sleep with Sentinel maintaining guard position, Jackson initiated the necessary notification protocols. His report to Elena Chambers was characteristically comprehensive, detailed documentation of Ethan's disclosure with careful distinction between direct quotation and interpretive assessment, contextual notes regarding disclosure circumstances, and objective observations of emotional presentation throughout the conversation. Her response was immediate and multifaceted. The information regarding Decker's ex-wife triggered immediate investigative action through law enforcement channels. The disclosed abuse patterns necessitated adjustment to Ethan's therapeutic intervention plan. Most significantly, the voluntary disclosure to Jackson, rather than clinical professionals, prompted reconsideration of the placement duration parameters. "His disclosure to you represents significant attachment development," Elena explained during their secure call. "The therapeutic team believes disrupting this emerging trust relationship would be potentially damaging at this critical juncture." Done. What had begun as an emergency placement with expected duration of 2 to 4 weeks was now being evaluated for extension to 6 to 12 months, pending ongoing assessment and formal certification processes. This prospect introduced complex considerations for Jackson's carefully structured independent living arrangement, requiring substantial adaptation beyond the temporary accommodations initially implemented. The following morning, as Jackson prepared breakfast according to their established routine, he observed subtle but significant changes in Ethan's demeanor. The hypervigilance that typically characterized his morning behavior had diminished noticeably. His communication included more direct eye contact. Most tellingly, he positioned himself physically closer to Jackson than his previous comfort parameters. "Had allowed, I slept better," Ethan reported, accepting the nutritionally balanced breakfast with less hesitation than usual. "Only one bad dream, and Sentinel helped when I woke up." "Good tactical support," Jackson acknowledged, continuing. "Their established pattern of recognizing progress without excessive focus that might create performance pressure." As they completed the morning routine and prepared for school transportation, Ethan paused near the door. "The other kids at therapy group talk about what happened to them," he said, his voice carrying unusual determination. "I think maybe I could do that now. Tell the doctors what I told you." The significance of this statement transcended its simple content. It represented Ethan's first voluntary engagement with the therapeutic process beyond compliance-based participation, a critical threshold in trauma recovery that often predicted substantive progress across multiple domains. "Courageous decision," Jackson affirmed, recognizing the importance of acknowledging the choice without applying pressure that might trigger compliance patterns. Ethan considered this assessment with characteristic seriousness. "You said courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing things even when you are scared." "Correct," Jackson confirmed, noting the internalization of this alternative definition, a conceptual framework that contradicted the destructive narratives Decker had systematically installed. As Ethan departed for school with his child welfare transportation provider, Jackson remained in the doorway, observing until the vehicle disappeared from view. The developments of the past 24 hours had fundamentally altered the parameters of his involvement beyond anything he had anticipated when accepting the emergency placement. The mission had expanded from temporary stabilization to comprehensive recovery support, a deployment with no defined end date or clear operational boundaries. It would require resource allocation far beyond his initial calculations, potentially disrupting the carefully controlled independence he had established following his medical retirement. Yet, as he turned back to his adapted living space, now bearing evidence of Ethan's presence throughout, Jackson recognized that this mission aligned with core principles that had always defined his service. Protect the vulnerable, adapt to evolving requirements, and never abandon those who depend on your capabilities. Different battlefield, same essential duty. Different implementation, same fundamental purpose. The Jefferson County District Attorney's Office occupied the third floor of the County Administrative Building, a utilitarian structure of glass and steel that contrasted sharply with the classical architecture of the courthouse across the plaza. Assistant District Attorney Marissa Velez's corner office provided a direct view of the courthouse steps where media crews had maintained near constant presence since the dramatic revelations in the Decker case. Jackson sat across from her desk, his wheelchair positioned at the precise angle that afforded optimal visibility of both Velez and the door, a habitual tactical positioning that had become second nature since his injury. Sentinel lay at attention beside him, monitoring environmental variables with the same vigilance he had displayed in combat zones. "First, I want to thank you for coming in, Sergeant Reeves," Velez began, her professional demeanor balanced with genuine appreciation. "The information Ethan disclosed regarding his mother has created significant complications for our case preparation." Jackson nodded once, acknowledging the statement without unnecessary verbal response. "We've located preliminary evidence corroborating his account," she continued, opening a file on her desk. "Christina Decker's last documented appearance was a visit to Fairview Memorial Hospital Emergency Department 14 months ago. She was treated for injuries consistent with physical assault, though she attributed them to a fall. Surveillance footage shows Raymond Decker accompanying her, remaining present throughout treatment." This information aligned with the timeline Ethan had described, his mother's disappearance occurring shortly after she had threatened to report Decker's escalating violence. Phone records show her cell service was terminated 2 days later. Credit cards became inactive. Employment records indicate she never collected her final paycheck from the dental office where she worked as a receptionist. Velez closed the file with controlled precision. These aren't conclusive indicators of foul play, but they establish a pattern consistent with Ethan's disclosure. Investigation status, Jackson asked, his economical communication style focused on essential information. The department has opened a missing persons case retroactively, with potential escalation to homicide investigation pending further evidence. Search warrants for the Decker residence and property records are being processed. Velez leaned forward slightly. This is where complications arise. The investigation requires forensic examination of locations Ethan may need to discuss in testimony. The process could be significantly expedited with his cooperation. The unstated request hung in the air between them. The prosecution needed Ethan's assistance with the investigation into his mother's disappearance, yet such involvement carried substantial psychological risks for a child already navigating severe trauma. His trauma therapist has advised against direct involvement, Jackson stated, the information delivered without emotional inflection, but with unmistakable definitiveness. Velez nodded, having anticipated this response. I understand the therapeutic concerns. However, there are time-sensitive aspects to this investigation. Physical evidence degrades. Witness memories become less reliable. Every day that passes potentially compromises our ability to determine what happened to Christina Decker. Alternative approaches? Jackson prompted, acknowledging the legitimate investigative concerns while maintaining focus on Ethan's psychological protection. We've developed a modified protocol that might balance these priorities, Velez explained, retrieving another file. It would involve Ethan providing information through structured interviews with his trauma therapist present, using specialized forensic questioning techniques designed to minimize re-traumatization. No scene visits would be required at this stage. She slid a document across the desk, a detailed interview protocol developed in consultation with the Child Advocacy Center. Jackson reviewed it with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to all operational planning, identifying potential vulnerabilities and stress points with practiced precision. The process incorporates significant protective measures, Velez continued. Sessions would be limited to 30 minutes maximum, immediate termination protocols if distress indicators emerge, full therapeutic support before, during, and after each session. Jackson completed his assessment of the document, recognizing the careful attention to trauma-informed practices while maintaining investigative integrity. It represented a thoughtfully constructed compromise between competing priorities, child protection versus evidentiary requirements, though still carried inherent risks to Ethan's fragile recovery process. I'll discuss with his treatment team, Jackson decided, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposal outright. Final determination requires multidisciplinary assessment. Velez accepted this response with professional understanding. I appreciate your consideration. There's another matter we need to discuss, one with more immediate implications. Her tone shifted subtly, signaling increased significance. Raymond Decker has been denied bail due to flight risk and potential witness intimidation concerns. However, he's retained specialized legal representation through the Courthouse Employees Union. His defense team has filed motions challenging various aspects of our case, including the admissibility of evidence obtained through Sentinel's involvement. This development wasn't unexpected. The unusual nature of Sentinel's evidence detection had created procedural questions that would inevitably require judicial review. Their primary argument centers on what they term non-standard evidence acquisition methodology, Velez explained. They're challenging whether Sentinel's training meets established forensic standards for evidence detection and whether his alerts can be considered reliable from an evidentiary perspective. Jackson understood the legal strategy immediately, By attacking the methodology rather than the evidence itself, Decker's defense team was attempting to exclude crucial physical evidence that directly linked him to abuse patterns spanning multiple incidents. They've filed for an evidentiary. Hearings specifically focused on Sentinel's training, certification, and reliability, Velez continued. This hearing would require comprehensive documentation of his military working dog certification, his transition training for service work, and specific evidence regarding his scent discrimination capabilities. The implications extended beyond procedural considerations. Such a hearing would necessarily involve testimony regarding Jackson and Sentinel's military deployment, including classified operations that had limited documentation available for civilian review. It would also require Jackson to subject Sentinel to formal testing protocols designed for police K-9 units rather than specialized service animals. When? Jackson asked, already calculating preparation requirements. 3 weeks from tomorrow, Velez replied. I've requested a delay citing preparation requirements, but Judge Watkins denied the motion. He's known to favor stringent evidence admissibility standards. This accelerated timeline created significant logistical challenges. Comprehensive documentation of Sentinel's military certification would require expedited security clearance reviews. Adaptation of his specialized capabilities to standardized testing protocols would demand intensive preparation. Most significantly, the hearing would necessarily expose operational details of their military service that Jackson had deliberately compartmentalized in his civilian transition. What resources do you need from our office? Velez asked, recognizing the complexity of the preparation requirements. Military records expedited through proper channels, Jackson responded. JAG liaison for classified documentation review. K-9 certification specialist familiar with military to civilian transition. Protocols. Velez made notes with practiced efficiency. I've already contacted Captain Harlow from the Military Working Dog Program. She's agreed to provide expert testimony regarding Sentinel's original training and certification standards. This connection to their military past represented both advantage and complication. Captain Layla Harlow had facilitated Sentinel's transfer to Jackson following their injuries, navigating complex bureaucratic processes to keep them together. Her expert testimony would carry substantial credibility regarding Sentinel's capabilities, but would necessarily involve discussion of classified operations that had established those capabilities. There's another consideration, Velez added, her expression growing more serious. This hearing will be separate from the primary case proceedings, but it won't be closed. Decker's defense team has specifically requested media access, arguing that the methodological questions involve matters of public interest regarding evidence reliability standards. The strategic implication was immediately clear. Beyond the evidentiary challenge, Decker's team was attempting to shift public narrative by focusing attention on procedural technicalities rather than substantive evidence of abuse. Media coverage would inevitably emphasize the unusual nature of Sentinel's involvement, potentially casting doubt on conventional evidence through association. Your participation would necessarily involve public testimony, Velez concluded. Given your previous avoidance of media exposure, I wanted to ensure you understood this implication fully. Jackson's deliberate maintenance of privacy following his medical retirement had been a cornerstone of his recovery process. The controlled environment he had established depended significantly on minimal public engagement and limited exposure to unpredictable social variables. This hearing would necessarily disrupt that protective boundary, creating potential vulnerability precisely when stability was essential for Ethan's placement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one Hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.